What is Kant's Transcendental Idealism? Well, that's not an easy question to answer, and let me start by saying that the story that I will tell in this video is not uncontroversial. Right? Kant scholars don't agree about what Transcendental Idealism is. But I think I can tell you a story that is certainly better than the standard story that you find sort of everywhere in popular introductions. And that is an extremely interesting philosophical position. So, let's start with what I call the standard story of Transcendental Idealism. And this is a story that is almost certainly familiar with you, because you can find it in so many places where people, quickly introduce Kant to you, maybe in the context of an entire history of philosophy or in the context of some particular metaphysical or epistemological problem. And they tend to tell a story about Transcendental Idealism that goes like this. According to Kant, there is the real world, which consists of things in themselves, right? That's the real reality. But unfortunately, we can't really know this real reality, because when we start perceiving, our minds are going to distort that reality and give it a certain shape that depends on the way our minds work. And that shape is very radical, it touches the most central ontological categories almost that we have for understanding the world, because in the first place, our ways of perception are going to make all our experience spatial and temporal. And then the concepts of our mind are going to shape all experience such that it falls under categories like causation, existence, quantity, quality. And so all of that is a kind of framework through which the thing in itself has to move, by which it gets distorted, and then we experience it. Right? So, I know in advance, a priori, that all my experience is going to be of objects in space and time, and that it's going to be of objects that have causal relations to each other and that can be described in terms of quantity and quality and existence and possibility and so on. And I know all of that not because I have an a priori insight into the real reality, the thing in itself, but because I know that, my mind will distort the thing in itself into experiences that have these properties, these spatio-temporal and causal properties. So, this world that I experience then, we call the world of appearances, and that's the only world I can know something about, because through all the distortion, the thing in itself is hidden from me. I've put it in a very blatant way, right? I've emphasized words like distortion and hidden and things like that, but I think that it's fair to say that this is a standard story about Kant, right? Even if you don't emphasize those words, this is kind of what Kant is supposed to be saying. Like the real reality of the things in itself, we can't get there, but we have the world of appearances, which is shaped by our own minds, and that's it, right? That's what we have to make do with. This, I think I can say quite unequivocally, is not Kant's Transcendental Idealism. And I'm going to give you 4 reasons why this can't be what Kant means with Transcendental Idealism. Okay, here's the first reason. Kant thinks of his own philosophy as an answer to external world skepticism. In fact, he thinks it is the only possible answer to external world skepticism. He thinks that if you're not a transcendental idealist, if you are a transcendental realist, you will inevitably fall into external world skepticism. Only the transcendental idealist does not. But the story I've just been telling you is not an answer to external world skepticism. It is external world skepticism, right? If the real reality is the thing in itself, and if the world of appearances is just a distortion, like what our minds make of the thing in itself, then we can't know the external reality, but only the internal ideas that come into our mind. That is external world skepticism. And then Kant is supposed to say something like, yeah, well, but at least we can have a priori knowledge about these appearances. But who cares, right? It's as if you are duped by Descartes' demon, but then you say, well, at least I have some knowledge about all these illusions that the demon gives me. It's not an answer to skepticism. It is skepticism itself. Okay, so that's one reason to think that the story I just told, it can't be Kant's story. It's not transcendental idealism. Okay, here's the second reason. When Kant talks about how we perceive the world, and how we get any knowledge, and even how we think about objects at all, like one of his key terms is intuition, German Anschauung, intuition. And he defines intuition as an episode of being in immediate contact with an object. Right? So when I have intuition, which I have in all like real experience, I am in immediate contact with the object. But in the story I just told you, there is no immediate contact with an object. Right? I mean, the object, the thing in itself, is hidden. It's behind the distortion. Like the world of appearances is between me and the real reality. It makes no sense to talk about immediate contact, to take this notion of intuition and put it front and center of the story of transcendental idealism, which is what Kant does. So again, I think that, it makes no sense of what Kant is actually doing to think of transcendental idealism in the terms that I presented it to you. Number 3, if this story about transcendental idealism is true, then it is extremely unclear why Kant claims that things in themselves are not in space and time. Right? Even if space and time are the forms of our perception, it would seem to be an open question whether those forms distort the thing in itself, because the thing in itself is not spatiotemporal, and then, we have to experience it as spatiotemporal, that's a distortion. Or whether maybe, fortunately, the thing in itself is already spatiotemporal. And so when it comes through these forms of our perception, nothing happens to it, and we see it exactly as it is. Right? And so Kant, when he claims that things in themselves are not spatiotemporal, seems to have forgotten something. Right? He seems to have forgotten the possibility that things in themselves just are spatiotemporal. There's nothing in the story I just told you that allows us to say that they are not. And this has actually historically been a very important anti-Kantian argument, which is known as the forgotten alternative. But it makes no sense to believe that Kant forgot this. First of all, it's such an obvious thought that, hey, maybe the things themselves are spatiotemporal. But it's not just obvious to us. It would have been obvious to Kant as well, because it was the orthodox position in his time. Right? If you think of people like Locke and the primary-secondary qualities distinction, well, the primary qualities, right, that what the object itself has, is space and time, right? It's size and shape and velocity. So everyone is thinking about objects, the real objects being sort of hidden from us to a certain extent by our ideas. And then the standard theory is that, some qualities, namely space and time, are there in the real object. And now we have to imagine that that's the alternative that Kant forgot to think about, and he just blatantly claimed to know that the objects themselves are not spatiotemporal. It makes no sense, right? That can't be transcendental idealism. If Kant claims that the things in themselves are not spatiotemporal, then transcendental idealism must be something different. It must be a theory on which it makes sense to say this thing. All right, number 4. One of the most important and difficult parts of the critique of pure reason is the so-called transcendental deduction of the categories. And I don't want to go into any details about that, but what Kant does in the transcendental deduction of the categories is he tries to show that these categories of the human mind, causation, quality, quantity, that we can, with right, apply them to the objects. But if the objects, as they come to us, right, the objects in the phenomenal world, are just shaped by those concepts. They're just distorted until they fit those concepts. If that's the story, then of course the concepts are going to fit the phenomena. And equally, of course, they're not going to fit the things in themselves. So there's no question. I mean, there's no reason to write a transcendental deduction. All right. Okay, those were 4 reasons. 4 reasons to think that this classic standard story of transcendental idealism can't be right. So what is the right story about transcendental idealism? Well, again, this is not uncontroversial, but here's the story I would like to tell you. Let's start by defining the opposite of transcendental idealism, which is what Kant calls transcendental realism. And according to Kant, everybody before him was a transcendental realist. So what does the transcendental realist say? The transcendental realist tells us that the standards of reality, right, what it is for something to be real, the standards of reality, are independent of, and I suppose we could say prior to, the standards of our thinking. So let me say that again. The transcendental realist is somebody who says that the standards of reality are independent of, prior to, our standards of thinking, the standards of our thought. And here, our thought means human thought, or more generally, it means the kind of thinking that finite, rational beings, so beings who are in the world, who are not gods, who have to get to know the world through perception, for instance, the kind of thought that those kinds of beings have. Okay, so our standards, like our epistemic standards, how we come to know things, how we judge about things, those standards are supposed to be later and certainly not more fundamental than the standards of reality, right? There's first what it is for something to be real, and then there are our ways of trying to get to know reality, right? And our standards have to answer to the standards of reality, right? Of our standards, our ways of thinking, our ways of judging, like even our best ways of judging, like our logic, our concepts, our forms of perception, and so on. Of all of those things, it is maybe an open question, but certainly a sensible question, whether they fit the standards of reality, right? We need to hear something about that, right? Maybe we need to hear that God has created us in such a way that we can understand reality. Or maybe we need some other story, or maybe we're going to fall into skepticism. But what it is for something to be real is independent of how we get to know things and how we ought to think, right? What it is for something to be real is independent of how we ought to think. It's prior, it's earlier. So what's the transcendental idealist? Well, the transcendental idealist is somebody who denies this. It's somebody who claims that the standards of reality are the standards of our finite thought, right? To be real is to fit how we ought to think about the world. That is what it is to be real. Right? If we want to understand what it is for an object to exist, well, we have to look at the standards of our finite ways of thinking, and anything that comes out as, being an appropriate object for judging, being an appropriate thing to posit and believe in, that's something that exists. Okay, so I'm going to try to make that a little bit less abstract. Well, here's one way in which Kant tries to make this a little bit less abstract. It's still quite abstract, but he tries to draw a distinction between our finite mode of thinking and divine thought. And Henry Allison, in his very interesting book, Kant's Transcendental Idealism, actually claims that transcendental idealism is a rejection of what he calls the theocentric model of cognition. So the theocentric model of cognition is a model of cognition, a model of thinking about the world, that puts God in the center. And Allison's idea here is that, like, traditionally, we would think, okay, what is reality? Well, reality is the world as God sees it. And we have to try to approach that, right? And insofar as we manage to approach it, we have good knowledge, right? Insofar as we manage to approach it, we grasp reality. So reality is what God grasps, or what God would grasp if God existed. We have to approach that. And of course, a crucial element of that story is that there is a kind of continuity between God's view of the world and ours. Like, our view might be infinitely worse, right? We know infinitely less. It's far less accurate than anything God knows, maybe infinitely less accurate. We are fallible and God is infallible. So there are all these distinctions. But when we are right, there is a sense in which we know something just the way that God does it. Right? If I know there's a Nietzsche bust in my room, well, God also knows that there's a Nietzsche bust in my room, right? So when I have a true thought, I'm sort of sharing in an insight that God has, even if the gap between a divine thinker and me might be infinitely big. So that's sort of one way of thinking about what it is to have a correct, right thought. And this is a way of thinking that makes reality independent of our standards of cognition. Right? I mean, there's reality, which is what God would know if he existed. And then there's our ways of thinking, and we have to approach to this reality. One of the things that Kant does in the Critique of Pure Reason, in a few brief passages, is he talks about what infinite cognition would be like. So the cognition of God. And he says, well, so God also is going to be, I mean, if you want to think about objects, you've got to be in contact with objects through what Kant calls intuition, a direct contact with objects. And for us, intuition is passive. It is perception, right? The object works on us. We get perception. We get experience. But for God, intuition would be active. Right? God would be in direct contact with objects by creating them, right? Like his contact with objects is the creation of the objects. And he would be in direct contact with every individual object in its perfect individuality. And so Kant thinks that God wouldn't even use concepts. Right? A concept is a sort of general rule under which we fit objects in order to think them, because we can't grasp them in their full individuality. And so God doesn't use concepts. And in fact, Kant says God doesn't think, where thinking means using concepts. And so whatever God is, however God's cognition would work, like this creative and immediate grasp of every object in its individuality, Kant says, well, look, we can't understand what that is. We can't even know whether it's possible. But it is certainly, this is not Kant's term because this term doesn't exist at the time of Kant, but it is certainly incommensurable with our thought. Right? Finite thinking and infinite thinking would be so different that there's no way to compare them. Right? God doesn't even use concepts. God doesn't judge. Right? God doesn't think things like, there is a Nietzsche bust in my room. That's not a possible way of thinking about God. Then you are taking the standards of finite cognition and applying them to a supposedly completely different being. Okay, what does that mean? Well, that means that whatever our thinking is, it has to stand on its own legs. Right? You can't compare it to God's thinking, and so its goodness cannot be judged by comparing it to the standards of God's knowledge, because these things are incomparable. These standards of a putative infinite intelligence are just not applicable to finite intelligence, not because they're too high, but because they're too different. And so the only standards that apply to our thought are our standards. And in a sense, that's a good thing, because that means that, thought is normative, that we are responsible for our thinking, that it comes from ourselves, that we are autonomous as thinkers. Okay, so what we could say is that the only standards that there are for finite thought are the standards of finite thought, and not some standards coming from somewhere else that are the standards of God or the standards of reality. And now we can see the relation between Allison's claim, right, that Transcendental Realism is the theocentric model of cognition, and my claim that Transcendental Realism is the claim that the standards of reality are prior to the standards of finite thinking. Right? No, the Transcendental Idealist says, the only standards that there are for our thinking are the standards for our thinking. We do not have to approach to reality. Why not? Because the standards for our thinking are the only standards that we have for even understanding the idea of reality. Right? To say that something is real just is to say that it falls under and fits in with the standards of our thinking. So what should we say about this thing in itself, right? This famous Kantian idea? Well, what we should say about the thing in itself is not that it's the real reality. Right? To say that the thing in itself is the real reality is precisely to be a transcendental realist. Right? It's precisely to be what Kant doesn't want to be. The thing in itself is, when we think the thought of, well, what would things be like independent of the standards of our cognition, of our thinking? And of course, the only thing we can say is that, we can't say. Right? We don't even have a conception of reality that is independent of our standards of reality, of our standards of thinking. And so there's really nothing we can say about the thing in itself. And the only reason that we need this idea of the thing in itself in our philosophy is because we want to say that we are finite beings, that we don't create the world, that in a sense the world is independent of us, but we can't even conceive of this independence, and we certainly can't think of it as more real or the real reality or that which causes the phenomenal world or something like that. So the thing in itself, in my interpretation of transcendental idealism, has a fairly minimal role, right? It's a sort of reminder of our finitude, the reminder of the fact that we are not gods, that our standards are not the standards as such, but is not the real reality. The only standards that we have to answer to are our own standards. Okay, so what is it to be an object, right? What is it to be real? Well, to be real is to fit our standards of thinking, and that is, to be real is to be in space and time, right? Which are our forms of intuition. And to be real is to be part of a causal network, which is sort of the central category of how we conceptualize the world. That's what it is to be real. It is to be a thing that is in space and time, that is causally connected to other things. That is what reality is, right? That's the transcendental idealist story that Kant is telling us. Well, if that's the story, then actually all the 4 points that the standard story couldn't make sense of suddenly make sense, right? We can see why Kant thinks that this is an answer to skepticism. Skepticism about the external world only gets started once we have a distinction between 2 things: reality and our standards of thinking, and the worry that our standards of thinking might not fit reality. But there is no distinction between reality and our standards of thinking in Kant. And so skepticism can't even get off the ground. Okay, what about the idea that intuition is being in immediate contact with an object? Well, intuition is being in immediate contact with an object, right? To what are objects? Well, objects are things in space and time that are causally connected to other things, right? In experience, we are in causal contact with things in space and time. It makes sense to think of this in terms of immediate contact. What about the forgotten alternative? Just to remind you, Kant claims that things in themselves are not in space and time. And the thought was, well, why can't they be? Well, they can't be in space and time, Kant would say, because space and time are, finite forms of thinking. And Kant has to say a little bit more to make this plausible, I think. But he does say more about that. He tries to show that it makes sense to think of space and time as forms of perception. Now, perception is something that only finite beings have. God doesn't perceive. And he also shows that space and time have everything to do with causation and the other categories, which are forms of judgment. They are sort of the essential elements of judgment. And again, judging, thinking things in terms of concepts is something that only finite cognition does. So I think Kant has a story about why space and time are one-on-one connected to the idea of a finite thinker and the standards of finite cognition. What is a thing in itself? Well, a thing in itself is the bare thought of things independently of our forms of cognition. If space and time are our forms of cognition, and things in themselves are just the bare idea of things independent of our forms of cognition, then of course they are thought independently of space and time. Right? So things in themselves are not spatiotemporal. If they were spatiotemporal, we would be thinking them under our forms of cognition. So again, there is no forgotten alternative here. It only seems that way if you misunderstand transcendental idealism. Number 4, transcendental deduction of the categories. Why does Kant need to show that we can apply these concepts, these categories of our mind, to objects? Well, he needs to do two things, right? He needs to show that these categories really are the conditions of what it is to be real, of what it is to be an object. And so that's one of the things that he does in the transcendental deduction. He shows from the idea of an object and from the idea of these categories as the fundamental elements of judgment, he tries to show that you can't have one without the other, right? They have to be applicable to objects for there to be objects and for there to be judgment. And then he also tries to show the relation between that and space and time. He tries to show that an object given in space and time and an object given under the categories are actually the same thing, right? It comes down to the same thing. So that's what's happening in the transcendental deduction. Okay, so we understand why it has to be written. So, as far as I can see, this story about transcendental idealism, I'm not claiming that it solves every interpretive problem in Kant's work. There are definitely passages where Kant seems to be saying things that don't fit my story that well. That's true for every interpretation, by the way. But I think it makes a lot of sense of a lot of things that Kant does, and it shows us how transcendental idealism is a real alternative to the kinds of positions that we've been thinking about. At the very end, let me return to the question of perception. What exactly is Kant's story about perception? Well, when we perceive an object, we are in immediate contact with it, right? That's intuition. And so it makes a lot of sense to think of Kant as a direct realist, as somebody who thinks that when we perceive an elephant, we're just seeing the elephant. There's nothing between us and the elephant. In particular, perception is not an appearance being between us and a thing in itself, right? That's the wrong story about transcendental idealism. On the contrary, the object is the elephant. It's an appearance. We are in immediate contact with it. And it would seem to me that, although Kant, of course, doesn't talk of himself in this way, it makes some sense to think of Kant as a disjunctivist, right? As somebody who thinks that a real perception, a real experience of an elephant, and a hallucination of an elephant are just two totally different kinds of events, right? In the one case, I have intuition. In the other case, there's no contact, no immediate contact with an object. There's no intuition, and Kant would say there's no experience. There's no experience going on. Sensation maybe, but not experience. So, maybe surprisingly, rather than being the most extreme kind of indirect realist, right, who says that the appearance is between us and reality and we can know nothing about reality, Kant is actually a direct realist. I think that's the only way to make sense of his story about transcendental idealism and about perception.